All right, hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. I'm Stephanie, and I'm joined here today by our producer Jimmy. Hi, Jimmy.
Hi, Steph.
And Dr. Lee O'Brien, who has kindly volunteered to talk to us today about one of her favourite things in the world, which is The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Now, this particular collection of stories turns 125 this year, and so we thought we'd celebrate its 125th birthday by talking about some of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, and this collection is blessed with some of the greatest, I think, Holmes short stories. So, Lee, you just reread all of these stories.
Yes.
How did you go?
Well, I was thinking, because I knew the podcast was coming up, and I thought, I know these stories so well, but I'd like to actually have them fresh in my mind. So I just started reading them because I couldn't put them down.
Yeah.
And I don't know. What did you ask me? What's so special about?
Well, yeah. So how did you feel? How did you feel going back to them? Did you enjoy them more or less? What did you enjoy about them?
It was funny because I know Jimmy loves A Scandal in Bohemia, and I was a bit bothered. I thought how clunky it was and how clunky the plot is.
It's quite sexist too.
Oh, deeply so.
Yeah.
But, he has an aversion to women.
He does have an aversion
They
to
actually
them.
say that. They use that phrase about him in one of the stories. And I thought it was... Because I always think of Conan Doyle's story, the Sherlock Holmes stories, as being perfect plots. I know there's holes in them, and a lot of editors nowadays do a lot of checking of all the facts, and they find that they're wrong, which I think is completely missing the point of the stories. But I always thought that you actually, when you're drawn into the stories, you believe the narrative setup. And I found I didn't in A Scandal in Bohemia, but I did for most of the rest of them. So I know Jimmy will probably defend it fiercely in a minute, but I was just and the generalisations he makes about women just drive me right up the wall. If you set fire to a room, the married woman will go for her baby, the single woman will reach for her jewels. Yes, right, okay. So
and she will defend her secrets,
Oh yes,
because all women
are like that.
Have all these secrets.
If this is the quality of his intellect, then I don't know why he's so famous. But a couple of things struck me. You were mentioning the Red-Headed League, and I thought, what is so brilliant about these stories is that he takes such very ordinary ideas, like somebody having very red hair, or the 5 orange pips.
Yeah,
somebody opens an envelope and the pips, little ordinary pips fall out, and he takes these very ordinary things and weaves this magically melodramatic crime story around them. And the man with the twisted lip, you think he's a young man of the city, and he's actually the beggar. He gets he's living by begging, and he's caught up with the evil Lascar and the opium den. So I love the way you get in these stories that linking of crime with the ordinary, even though the plots are extraordinary in terms of what happens. So I just love that about them. And I think too, I really like the sinister nature of the Copper Beeches, for example, where this young woman takes on this really strange job as a governess, and she has to cut off all her hair, and she gradually realises it's a classic Gothic mechanism. There's a young woman imprisoned in the house, and a really nasty crime is unfolding. So that I found what I expected. I thought the story, once he got into his stride, I just thought the stories were brilliant, and just as I always have felt about them. I guess the final problem, people tend to pick holes in that it's a bit melodramatic and all the rest of it. But no, it's just and of course we've got Holmes and Watson.
Yeah. 2
of the greatest characters in all of English lit. For me, Watson is, I think I've been in love with Watson for a long while. I started to think about the narration a bit more clearly, in detail, reading it this time, and I grew to like Watson's silences. Often when Holmes says something really outrageous, there's silent. You know from other parts of the narration that Watson is really bothered. The best instance of that is at the end of The Case of Identity, where he figures out that this nasty man, her stepfather, he's married to her mother, and they're swindling. It's a swindle. He impersonates a lover so that she won't leave and he'll lose access to her money. And at the end of it, when Holmes has sorted it all out, he's figured out the truth. And Watson says, well, what about Miss Mary Sutherland? And Holmes says, oh, I'm not going to tell her. She won't believe me. If you take a delusion away from a woman, you can no more do that than take a cub away from the tiger.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the story.
Yeah.
Watson never responds. And it's only when you've read them all that you know Watson is sort of reeling from the inhumanity of the man he thinks is the best man he's ever met. So I grew to like, I just thought, the more I look at these stories, the more I think Watson is just such a brilliant character and narrator.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And here's my defence of Scandal in Bohemia. Holmes is not really my favourite character. He's never been my favourite character throughout the entire story. And just, I suppose, in the same way that you were in love with Watson, I probably was in love with Irene Adler. Because I just thought she was such a wonderful character in that she worked on Holmes's weakness in a way that almost no other character works on his weakness, which is, in a way, his misogyny or his sexist attitude. She sort of plays with that, and she deceives him in a way that he has never really been deceived before.
Because he doesn't think a woman is capable of it.
Exactly. And I thought, she just does it so brilliantly. And of course, I love the BBC adaptation of Irene Adler. I think, Irene Adler as a dominatrix is just superb. But for me, Holmes is, he's actually quite annoying as a character personally. I find him quite an annoying character. And what actually drew me into all these stories is the fact that A Scandal in Bohemia was first amongst them. Because I got to see him defeated.
He fails,
He fails, and you never see him fail again. And it was almost like, well, if that came later on in the sequence, I might have been, oh yeah, there's a lot of issues with this particular story. But I was willing to overlook a lot of those issues only because it gave me that first real failure of Sherlock Holmes. He hints at, I think he says he's been defeated 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
Once by a woman and twice by a man or something to that nature. And he never, but you never hear those cases. Yeah. Even with Moriarty, he really does defeat Moriarty in the end as much as, unless you have the original ending. Genius. The evil genius, he still defeats him.
Yeah.
But Irene Adler is the one person who gets away, and Irene Adler is the one person that he, puts the title of the woman to, because she plays him.
She does play him.
She plays him.
And it was really easy to do.
And it was really easy to do, and that's the part that I love. She did it so effortlessly. Here's the most brilliant man that Watson or anybody has ever met, and here comes Irene Adler, and just like that, she gets him.
And it's quite clear that it's her, that walks past him in the street.
Yeah.
And it's quite,
But once he doesn't.
Yeah.
Recognize
and you think, what are you doing, Sherlock? We can see this.
And she butters him up so shamelessly in the letter. Even with all this, you made me reveal my secret. This stupid, clunky idea of all the actors out in the street and the smoke bomb. It's just plain silly.
Yeah.
And it really does make you wonder. As setting up, I think you're right, as setting up Holmes as the one who can't be beaten and who is invincible and always knows best. It really makes the whole machinations of the plot too obvious. And you have to believe too much silliness to believe that Holmes had any chance in that story. So that was, I just couldn't go along with it.
Yeah, one of the things that, again, I'm sort of bringing up my thesis again, but one of the things that I proposed in my thesis was that one of the things I noticed about Holmes is that he has a weakness when it comes to disguise. When people wear disguises, because he does a lot of disguise himself to trick other people, and he's often tricked by disguises himself. No more so than with Irene Adler. Adler tricks him more than anyone else. But we look at the man with the twisted lip. initially he was deceived. He was tricked by this. It took him a little while to sort of figure it out. It's like, hang on, now I got it. And so, if he has an Achilles heel of some sort, it's masks, it's disguises. And it's almost like Irene Adler taught him that lesson. It's like, here's what you are really weak at, because I disguise myself and you couldn't recognise me.
Well, what struck me again about rereading this, because I just reread the stories on the weekend too. In the Scandal in Bohemia, the king, when he finds out kind of what she's up, what she's really up to, he says, "Oh, what a great woman," and so that we're not all.
She was beneath me.
Even though she was beneath me, she was in fact beneath me on a social level. She's in fact horrendously intelligent and great, and Conan Doyle doesn't want you to go along with Sherlock Holmes. He wants you to look at Sherlock Holmes's attitudes towards women and see them for what they are, and that they're his weakness.
Because he didn't like Holmes at all. He was desperate to get rid of him. There were some funny letters where one of his friends said, "Set him off make him die in the falls. At least you don't have to pay for the funeral."
But I mean, you can see that, like, he's not represented in this kind of God. Like, I think that we have perhaps have a kind of cultural afterlife of him where he's set up as like infallible and godly, but I don't think that's there in the stories.
No, it's not there in the stories, and it's not there in Watson's. Although Watson loves him as a friend and admires him deeply as a man, he's never blind to his faults. This is why I get so annoyed when in any portrayals of Watson as an idiot, because he's not. He's actually very smart in what he can see, although it's a kind of ordinary man's smartness. And he can see through Holmes. It's just that he sees all the other good things about him and the things that he values. But I think the stories are always more complex, and the accounts of them would lead us to think, except maybe Sherlock. I mean, they get, in the BBC Sherlock, they get wonderful complexities in that.
Although in our Sherlock
in our
podcast,
previous...
Michelle and Steph both hated the last.
I didn't like the last one.
And I seem to be the exception.
I think it's nice to revisit the stories though after, because we know so many of them. We know there's been so many adaptations of The Scandal in Bohemia. There's a lot of these stories. The Red-Headed League, the Five Orange Pips, the Speckled Band. They're so kind of there in the kind of cultural imagination. It's nice to go back to the original stories. And the one that actually stood out for me in this collection, I have read it before, but I hadn't read it for years, was the Red-Headed League. I just thought it was so clever. That the idea of them staging a burglary by setting up a fake club for red-headed men where they have to type out the encyclopedia. It's just so outlandish, but it makes sense within the story.
And I love the little banker who comes in and he just doesn't believe any of this is going on. And he raps up with his stick on the floor, and Holmes says, "You have nearly imperiled the entire thing," and he has to go and sit on the box and behave himself. And there's lots and lots of instances in the stories where the people actually they make fun of Holmes. They don't think he's as good as he is. That's very good in the Reigate Squires, I think, where the young man thinks Holmes is an idiot. And I think that comes out in the Red-Headed League too, with the banker not really believing what Holmes is going to show them. And then, of course, they're all overwhelmed at the end with Holmes's brilliance. But the redhead. What did they say? As if a costermonger had tipped over his barrel of oranges when they're looking down the street and they're seeing all the redheads.
And on a plot level, like I really like plot. Like I really, that's what the thing I kind of respond to the most in any kind of novel or short story. And it's just so beautifully, brilliantly plotted, and yet it is so outlandish. This scheme that they've got for burrowing into the bank and to stealing all this stuff.
The villain is interesting because he's the one who's been to Eton and Oxford. He's a fallen aristocrat. The villain in the Red-Headed League, I think Spalding. I think that's him. There's a few aristocrats gone bad. In the stories, and I like that aspect of it too.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? The way that he sees through, I think, aristocrats in a way. Like when they come to see him, he picks up on their kind of the kind of weird class politics that are going on at the time, and especially in his relationship to them.
Yes. But I also think too there's a strain of really psychologically disturbing stuff in some of the villains.
Yeah.
It's in the Copper Beeches where there's that exchange where Holmes is really worried about the little son in this house he's going to, because the son is quite cruel. The son, he's
a brat. Yeah.
Yes, and he gets birds and mice and he tortures them to death. And Holmes actually says, as soon as I saw the son, I knew that we were in the presence of something really wrong, and you judge the parents by the way the child behaves. And the blackmail comes up again and again in the stories. The Boscombe Valley mystery and the Gloria Scott.
Yeah.
Where somebody has committed a crime in their youth and they come and they establish a good life, and then someone from the past, it's so gothic and it's so sensation fiction, comes and knows their secret and makes their life a misery and feeds off them until Holmes comes in and rescues them, although often that particular person dies at the end of the story. They don't survive being the truth coming out and all the rest of it. So he's actually playing, I think, with some really disturbing ideas of cruelty, physical cruelty, psychological cruelty, that add a depth to the stories. They're not just pot boilers. They're not
absolutely
funny
not
for the puzzle.
Yeah. I mean, that's quite interesting because I haven't done any research on it, but I believe one of the early signs of a serial killer is torture of animals.
Yes.
And I wonder whether this is something that Conan Doyle knew about, or when he sort of wrote that section, was this sort of one of those common ideas that didn't get developed until psychology. Sort of
the only other time
further.
I've come across it is in Agnes Grey and Bronte's novel.
Or Wuthering Heights, actually.
Wuthering Heights too, with Hareton is hanging the puppies off
Hindley.
the back of their head. No,
it's
Hareton.
Is it Hareton?
It's actually Hareton. And the romantic hero. I think I'm right. It's not Hindley. But in Agnes Grey, the little boy tortures animals. He traps them so that he can kill them. So there's a literary background to that. But I don't know about Freud is around in the 1890s, but I don't think he started publishing yet.
Yeah, I think he's slightly later.
But that whole, and the idea, the idea of a serial killer. I think Agatha Christie's the first one who brings into crime fiction the idea of a serial killer, the ABC murders. So, but obviously that. But I would say that understanding comes more from a literary perspective, comes from the Gothic, and it comes from sensation fiction. This whole idea of madness and disturbance. Because I think A Scandal in Bohemia, so much of that is from sensation fiction. The vixen woman and the cross-dressing. She's a cross-dresser.
And the blackmail.
And she's sexually active and she dallies with kings and yet she's dangerous. She's a femme fatale.
She's a femme fatale,
and that's all sensation fiction. So I often say to my students, you know that Freud didn't come from, all his ideas didn't come from the ether. All you have to do is read 19th century novels and the Gothic.
And I think even Freud himself has admitted that a lot of his ideas came from literature. The literary ideas.
Well, I think the thing that we forget about Sherlock Holmes, because he's, there's so many kind of things that are familiar to us, the deer stalker hat, which is not in the stories, but, in the movies and stuff. And all of the kind of cultural baggage that comes along with Sherlock Holmes is that they're really quite dark, many of them.
Oh, very dark.
They're about, obviously they're dark because they're about, murder and crime. But I think we do actually overlook the kind of real violence and the kind of more disturbing subject matter, which, as you say, Lee, is certainly there in the Copper Beeches, because, she's this woman who becomes involved with this family is in a very, very weird and disturbing situation.
And they check out that she has no family. And
they prey on her.
Yes, they do. Exactly. They're predators.
Yes, it's not it's comfort reading in some way, reading Holmes. Very much so, because it's it's so kind of familiar, and
because it's sorted out in the end.
And it's sorted out in the end. But I don't think that we should kind of skate over.
No.
The kind of real horror. I mean, even the engineer's thumb, where he gets his thumb cut off. I mean, it's just...
And there's the giggling man in that.
Yeah.
One of them's... Is it the engineer's son? No, I think I'm thinking of the resident patient. Am I? Or the Greek interpreter, sorry.
Is that in the further adventures?
Yes. Where there's the one young sort of thuggish man, but the other one is this kind of giggling man who's really even more frightening than the young man who has the strength to overwhelm the Greek interpreter. But it's in the Copper Beaches where there's that famous exchange where they're on their way through this beautiful countryside, and Watson is looking at these little isolated houses, and he said, "Look how beautiful this is." And Holmes says, "Well, when I look at these, I think how easy it is for cruelty. You know, who is going to hear the cry of a tortured child in an isolated house in the country? Whereas in the city, even in the slums, there's always somebody to hear if somebody's in trouble."
And that's such a flip from the way that the country has been written about in the history of English literature. That you know, the country is this wonderful green organic, wonderful natural place where people frolic and have great times, and it's all and the city is this degraded, terrible place. Whereas here, the city is, you know, at least there's people about. You know?
Well, and Holmes is saying that the crime is actually worse in the country because it's isolated and all these kind of things that can develop outside the city, where at least you have people who, you know, you might have the police and you might have neighbours who can be intrusive, but at least there's a kind of safety in numbers. But I think that the city is also presented as a ruined and dangerous place as well.
Certainly.
So it's just, it makes all these kinds of crimes possible. And a lot of the crimes, the engineer's thumb, a lot of the crime, the stockbroker's clerk, are linked to the new professions.
That's true.
So I think a lot of things people forget, that Holmes is creating himself through his new work. He didn't inherit, you know, wealth or whatever, although he comes from a family that he says he comes from squires, you know, ordinary, decent squires. But his family, Mycroft, they don't have any property. So Mycroft is part of the civil service, and Holmes is the only unofficial consulting detective.
And even Watson, he's a working doctor. And doctor doesn't have the cultural
these are professions.
weight.
Yes. So he's linking that. And these professions are possible in the city.
Yes, that's right.
So we've got the demonic city and the slum-ridden city, but we've also got the city that's full of endless possibilities for work and crime. But
yeah, like you see in these stories, the idea that like crime is everywhere, and there's all of this stuff is going on constantly, and there's all these references to cases that he's working on that we don't hear about. Or you know, I'm balancing 4 cases at the moment, and this is just the most interesting one this afternoon or whatever. So it's a constant kind of thing. The Speckled Band as well. That I love the Speckled Band.
And we've got the Doctor, Grimsby Roylott in that. He's scary.
He is scary,
he's a psychopath.
And again we see animals here, although he's not torturing animals, but he's using animals as a mechanism by which to get what he wants. It's surprisingly, not surprisingly, but maybe unexpectedly dark.
We can't leave animals without talking about the mongoose in The Crooked Man. Don't you love that one?
I didn't reread The Crooked. That's not in the Adventures. Is that in memoirs?
Yes, it's a locked room memory. It's a locked room mystery.
Yeah.
And they find out, Holmes sees signs that this amazing creature has run up the curtain, and he's followed the footprints, and it turns out to be a mongoose called Teddy.
Of course.
And when he finds out it's Teddy, it's my favourite question of all of the Holmes stories. Who's Teddy? Says Holmes. And Holmes knows it's an animal, so he doesn't say, what is Teddy?
Yeah.
He says, who's Teddy? And I thought, I'll forgive him a lot for that.
Well, which one?
He's a wonderful mongoose, and he's and the Crooked Man is dark.
Yeah.
Because in the Soldier, they've been out in India, so it's Empire.
Yeah.
And it's been a terrible tale of betrayal and getting the girl under false pretenses, and his sins come back to him, and the crooked man is the poor man who comes back, who's been tortured, and he sees the woman he lost, and all that. It's a wonderful story, and it brings in empire too. So we've been talking about the country, the city, but like the Sign of Four, there's and see, Watson comes back from Afghanistan.
That's right.
They're fighting in Afghanistan in the 1880s. They've always been fighting.
And then to today,
So it's all that empire stuff swirling around the edges of these extraordinarily literary stories.
Yeah, they're not isolated from the kind of politics of the day. They're very much engaged with that late Victorian world.
Yes. And Watson coming back wounded and hurt from empire, and they just give him a pension and just leave him.
Yeah, that's right. And he's this war hero.
Yes, and if he hadn't met Holmes, he'd just be, what is he called, the great London, the great cesspool where all the idlers and loungers of the empire gather. And he includes himself in that.
The one that I also enjoyed rereading was The Blue Carbuncle with the goose.
The goose that laid the golden.
The goose that laid the blue carbuncle. I love it. I love that there's this, that his thought was when he's got the carbuncle in his hand is, oh, I know, I'll find a goose and stick it down his throat. And then, it becomes Christmas dinner.
And the poor old commissionaire finds it. And there's a reward. I'm really worried about that. Do we ever find out that the commissionaire gets the reward? Because Holmes is very imperious, as he is. Give me the carbuncle, young man, and go and do this, that, and the other. And I think, well, hang on a minute. Yeah, he's the guy, because they were eating the goose.
Yeah,
they
that's
found
right.
the thing in the crop. And I think, hang on, is the commissionaire going to get his reward?
For accidentally stumbling upon him.
Yeah, he's a frightful snob. He sort of dismisses people left, right,
I have to say, rereading these stories, which again I haven't read for about, only knows, 15 years, Holmes is so annoying. I really, really hate those sequences. I know that they're kind of fun on one level, but those sequences where he just deducts things that he doesn't have to deduct in order to show off his deduction skills. I know that your wife doesn't love you anymore because look at the dust on your coat
and your hat isn't polished. And
and I find them tiresome after a while. Like I think that kind of stuff is cool when you first read it and or when you first come across it, that he's so good at deducing things that he can deduce your sock is dirty on this side or something, and therefore you've done this.
And the
but
mud is of a peculiar consistency.
Or then he goes and looks at burrows in the ash and he says, oh well, this is from that cigar, and I just think, stop showing off, mate.
I think that I did maybe it was a mistake or maybe it was a good thing to do, but I read all the stories in one sitting basically. So I sat down and I read everything from beginning all the way through to the end.
Of the 2 volumes?
No, of all the Sherlock Holmes stories.
Everything.
Every
single one.
So I'm one of the few people who didn't actually sort of spaced it out.
Binge reading.
I know it was severest form of binge reading.
I reckon he would really grate on you after that.
He did.
Yeah.
And I think my formation of this idea that Holmes is really irritating came round about I think after his resurrection, because I liked him up until that period, and then he started becoming overbearing, and then by the last collection of short story, he was just unbearable. And it didn't help that Watson disappears towards the end of the series too, and it was just absolutely unbearable when Watson wasn't there. I think there's a few stories I noted here. 2 that's told in third person and 2 that's narrated by Holmes.
And they're not in this collection.
They're not in this collection. They're in the later collections,
ones,
but they were the most painful stories to read.
You really need Watson to humanise Holmes. Otherwise he's just awful.
You do, and you need Watson's voice. You need Watson's presence and his voice in order to really appreciate Holmes as the character. One of the things I often say is the reason we like Holmes is because Watson does.
Likes him.
And so we like Watson, and therefore by extension we kind of begrudgingly like Holmes.
Well, and Watson admires Holmes, so therefore you're positioned to admire him too.
So I always think of Holmes as that annoying friend who your best friend is a really good friend with. So you're kind of like, fine, I'll put up with you.
Yeah,
do we have to invite him? But all
he's
right,
always showing off.
Yeah.
He's so annoying. Yeah.
But all right, you like him, so that's okay. We'll play along with you as well. But one of the main attractions for me, and one of the things that kept me going with all the stories, is actually all the side characters. The introduction, this plethora of amazing characters that some of them, well, most of them only appear for one story, and they just never
they
appear
go.
again.
They never.
They go, you know. And I'm always
again,
hoping that some of them would come back, and you know, most of them never do. Even Mary Morstan, who really gets mentioned.
Poor Mary.
I know, here and there, but she disappears completely, even though she's married to Watson. What the hell happened to her?
And occasionally she pops up.
You can go off with your friends.
Yeah, exactly. She pops up and just says, "Oh, you better go visit Sherlock," and he does, and then never you hear about her again. That's where women are.
I think it's in The Empty House, because when I got to the end of this, I had to read The Empty House, which is the one where he comes back, which I think is one of the best stories, because Colonel Moran is such a wonderful villain. And he's stalking Holmes with the air rifle.
And it was quite a dangerous one. I mean, I think it's the only time that I kind of felt a sense of danger for Holmes.
Yeah, very much so. And for Watson too.
Yeah, it was a very suspenseful
And
story.
Watson doesn't hesitate to go with him. Watson never says no when Holmes says, let's do these silly things or dangerous things. Will you break the law?
It's just like
yes,
a bad
I
best
will.
friend, isn't it?
No,
I'll just leave my my medical practice and just
and they have
follow
to kill
you
off
around.
the wife. I think it just
She got
got
in the way.
too difficult for poor Mary to be endlessly saying, "Yes, of course, dear."
Of course,
You
go
can-
off and with his harebrained schemes.
and
This
finding other
dude.
doctors to take. This is Holmes gets really annoyed when he asks Watson to do something, and Watson starts to say, "Oh, my practice," and he says, "Well, if your cases are more interesting than mine," and Watson says, "No, I was just going to say my practice can be looked after by somebody else." But yeah, I think. See, just listening to what you were saying about doing that binge reading thing, you realise how much the characterisation of Holmes is caught up in the nature of what detective fiction is, because you have to have he knows everything, he can solve everything, well, almost everything, so he has to have that kind of grating perfection of observation to him and analysis and deduction. And I think you're right when you see that endlessly reiterated. It's just that kind of formulaic necessity that bleeds back into a lack of satisfaction with the character. I think that's part of it. He's a victim of the formula.
Yeah, and I think he's too successful for too long. Almost,
Yes,
you almost every now and then wish he would just fail something.
But that's why Scandal in Bohemia is so refreshing.
Yeah, and I noticed when I was reading a lot of the stories too, when they mentioned cases that he's currently working on or having difficulties with, I almost wish I could get in on those cases, because I'm actually really curious about those cases that he hasn't solved yet. I know that
wonderful names, a giant rat of Sumatra.
And while I was reading, I was thinking, oh, I hope this story pops up later on, but they never do. And
No, that one of them does. The
One of them
second
does, do they?
stain, the scandal of the second stain,
Oh.
is the last one in the Return of Sherlock Holmes volume. I pulled that down from my bookshelf and it fell apart in my hands. I've read it so many times, but it's the Return is a wonderful collection of stories, and the second stain is the last one. And that's one of the ones that you're talking about, that Watson says, well, I see in my notes I have, these various cases that most of them you don't hear about, but that one you do.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really fascinating things about these stories, that if you have the time and the inclination, you would love to sit down and almost sort of plot out.
Yes.
The sequence of events
Yes.
and when things happen.
Yeah, that's right.
It'd be an undertaking in itself just to do. And
I think a lot of people have done that.
Have
actually.
they? Oh,
Yeah.
I attempted to do that. I started and then I got so jumbled and mixed up, and I thought, what
I don't
happened
think
when?
Conan Doyle gave that amount of care and attention to the
No,
stories.
he didn't.
No,
No,
he
I
didn't.
don't think he did either, and I don't think he bothered to check. We know with the speckled band that the snake can't slither. It can slither down the bell pull, but it can't slither.
survive.
It doesn't drink milk. It can't survive in the safe.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as an Indian swamp adder. Blah
And
blah blah.
apparently the same thing with the blue carbuncle. I
Yes.
just read recently, because geese
There's no
don't
such.
have. They don't have it. What do they call it? Where the throat gets stuck.
Right, the crop.
Yeah, the crop. Geese
yeah.
apparently don't have crops.
Oh,
So they wouldn't. So they
So he
wouldn't be able
wouldn't be
to.
there.
Yeah, they wouldn't be there. Yeah, so that's
oh,
one
for
of
heaven's sake.
that's one of the criticism about that
really?
story.
I
Yeah.
just felt sorry for that poor
Yeah.
goose.
Yeah, the Christmas
Oh, it's already
goose.
dead. It's okay.
Cooking
Yeah.
a goose.
Yeah, but he's got this madman sticking jewels down his throat. I mean, and then he dies. I mean, poor goose. That's not very
Where's
nice.
the RSPCA when we need it?
I know.
This episode's turned into like an animal cruelty discussion.
Yeah.
I know. Well, there are so many animals in the stories. There's always it always sort of hinges on an animal or there's some animals. But yeah, I think that
Do
you're.
you think they matter?
I don't think that
the mistakes.
I don't think the mistakes matter at all. I
I
mean,
don't know.
like I think that there's a certain kind of really obsessive fan that kind of gets hung up on that.
Yes.
But I think you just go along with it. Like I don't care if there's no such thing as an Indian swamp adder. Who cares? It's it's a really fun story.
Yeah.
It's really dark. It's gothic. It's interesting. It's endlessly rereadable.
And the whole idea of the speckled bandit can be the gypsy bandana, and can be a whole lot of things. And because I remember when I first read it, I didn't know what it was going to be.
Yeah, that's right. Well,
never...
actually, when we teach this in that particular story in our foundation unit, Engel 120, and students in the past have gotten very angry at this story because they say it's impossible to guess what the solution will be, and therefore it's cheating. It's like it's not.
Really?
It's not. Yeah, I've had students respond quite poorly because they say, you know, in a good detective novel, you should always be able to kind of guess if you're clever enough, predict who the murderer is, but you could not predict a snake in this story.
Yeah, but that idea of fair play never really existed until I think Agatha Christie. But even Agatha Christie cheats so many times.
I think that's a very contemporary understanding of detective fiction. That's more like a kind of police procedural kind of thing.
I think detective fiction nowadays have to play by those rules because it's under such heavy scrutiny.
Oh, are they?
And with the rise of the and with the rise of the internet as well, you know, anybody could just quickly hop online and check a particular fact. So
I don't want to read a story if I can pick out.
Yeah, I like it when
I
there's.
like being tricked. That's the whole fun of it.
And I often don't try and guess.
No,
like
I know
that that's what kind of you're supposed to read it and think, you know, I'm the detective and I'm going to solve it.
No,
but I don't want to solve it. I just want to. I want to
Yeah.
be surprised.
Because the writer has the cards, has all the cards, and you're only ever going to know what the writer wants you to know, and it's all the goose is cooked, the books are cooked, everything, the red herrings are in place. You never go. You know, I think I don't know. Do readers exist who want to pit themselves against a detective? I think that's just plain silly.
That's the reason even though I find Just Scandal in Bohemia refreshing in that we have that aspect of Sherlock failing. The reason that story doesn't kind of appeal to me as much as the others is because it is obvious what's actually happening. You kind of clear. It's as soon as that she walks past him and says "Good afternoon, Sherlock Holmes" or whatever she says. You're like, oh yeah, that's Irene. And so there's no mystery.
No, and then the photo is so important all the way through the story, and then suddenly it isn't.
And then she just says, "Oh, I won't use it. It's fine."
Oh, here you are. Yeah, I've got it.
All right.
And I'm married now, and it doesn't matter. And I thought, how does that work?
Yeah, like, don't worry about the photo.
She keeps the photo.
But she says, "I don't need it."
No. Well, what she says is that she's not going to use it, but it's going to be her protection against the king should he ever, tries to.
But what's he going to do?
What's he going to do?
Well, if he wants to, if he sends out assassins or whatever it is, you know, so it's basically meant to be her tool to protect herself. She has this thing that she can always blackmail him with. So should he ever, take steps towards her, she'll have this protection. So she'll keep it, but she's not going to use it because, she's happy now.
The reasons for him to go after her once she's married, they don't exist. Why would he go after her?
Well, for the scandal, I suppose.
Because is he getting married?
He is.
Yeah,
he wants to get married, and this photo sort of jeopardizes it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I suppose that's also her point, that, she's happy now, he's happy now. But as a security measure, she would still rather keep the
But then it was so important before, and then he just sort of says, all right.
That's it.
All right, you've still got the photo. It's still a threat to me, but whatever.
Well, no. What the king says, I know the story too well, I think. What the king said was, he knows Irene Adler, and if that's what she says, then she'll stick to it because she's always been a woman true to her word. Yeah. So if she says she's not going to use it, that's an assurance enough.
Goes.
Yeah, so she did threaten him with it, which is why he wanted the painting back.
Okay.
But now that she has assured that she's not going to use it, he's taking her word for it.
Oh, okay. Oh,
which
that's
is
all right.
Yeah, which is then when Holmes sort of said, he said, what a brilliant woman. Pity she was below my station. And Holmes says, yes,
she was a very different.
She was a very different station to you.
I'll get over it, Holmes. You lost fair and square. But see, that's why that story doesn't work because it's too. At least for me, it's too obvious what's actually happening. I like the stories where there's absolutely no way
Yes.
that you can, like, I mean, the Red-Headed League, like,
Yes.
there's no possible way you could guess.
See, I think the
that
stories
story.
that, and I think this is one of the things I really love about Sherlock Holmes, and talking about Sherlock Holmes too, is that different people have different aspects of the stories that they love. You know, so for you, Steph, you like the whole mystery of it. For me, I like it when characters have these witty games that they play with one another. So that's why Scandal in Bohemia really, you know, of course I knew it was Irene Adler, but I love the letter. Like that for me was the icing on the cake of the story. I love how she just, you know, sticks that knife into him and sort of twists around. And I thought, you know, you go.
You got him good.
Yeah, you got him good, you know. And it was just a moment of inspiration for me. And I love it when witty characters are pitted against each other. I love that intellectual game. And for me, the surprise isn't as important as how they play each other.
It's the character.
So, you know, so I did love the... forgot the name of the colonel now. With the empty house. You just mentioned him too. The
Colonel
villain.
Moran.
Colonel Moran.
Yeah.
You know, so there's another witty character who, you know, almost.
Oh, he's wonderful.
Yeah, he's wonderful, and
his
Moriarty.
Bag of tigers is unequalled.
Yeah, and those nemesis of Holmes, they're the ones that I look out for. You know, I'm constantly looking out for those sort of characters, because I love it when Holmes gets challenged in that way.
He needs to get challenged,
He
otherwise
does.
he's unbearable.
Exactly. I think for me they're the respite whenever he gets these characters who are so intelligent that it causes him to work just a little bit harder. Then I find those stories infinitely more interesting, and it doesn't really matter to me whether there's going to be a surprise ending or not. That alone is sort of worth it. It's the same thing that happens with I think Agatha Christie. When I read her stories, I have the same thing. You know, when they meet a particularly difficult case, I'm interested in how she goes about, you know, solving some of those cases.
And there would be a monotony too, wouldn't there, if it was just, you know, Sherlock Holmes easily solves cases. You know, how long can you sustain that?
Yes.
You know, maybe he has outlandish cases, but they're cases that are easily solved. He needs to have, you know, somebody that gives him a bit of trouble, that is difficult, that he has to fail occasionally, because otherwise it'd just be Sherlock Holmes solves another case. It's easy because he's very smart. You know, how many times can you, how often can you sustain that? It's nice to have a bit of a real challenge for him.
I mean, I often do wonder if Poe had continued with the Dupin story, how far he would have gotten with those stories before he, you know, sort of gone sick of it himself.
Well,
as
he ran up against Marie Roget and got that so terribly wrong.
Yes.
He had the poor man. He pitted his fictional detective against this real story and got it so fantastically wrong.
Wonderful case of hubris, I suppose.
Yes.
I've got to ask too, I mean, I know a bit about Conan Doyle and his interests apart from Sherlock Holmes, but why did he hate Sherlock Holmes so much? Is it just kind of because he had to write a lot of them?
Yeah, he was he wrote a lot of historical fiction.
Yeah, and it's pretty bad, isn't it?
I've never read it, but that's what he wanted people to read.
Yeah, and his spiritualist stuff.
Yeah, he
he's
also
got
wrote
some really weird.
He wrote a lot of science fiction stuff too, and he always thought that his other stories were superior to his.
So
Sherlock
is that
Holmes
why he
story.
hated Sherlock Holmes?
Yeah, he did. He in a way resented the Sherlock Holmes stories because he thought it's almost like, you know, you writing two separate work and one work which you think is a little bit beneath you, and that's the one that becomes popular.
Yes.
And there becomes this growing resentment over this creation of yours which you didn't really like that much, and this other one which you prize, but everybody sort of overlooks and thinks it's rather boring.
God, and nobody has. I don't think any writer has got their own work so wrong.
Yeah, I mean,
you know,
I think he did have one science fiction that was fairly successful. I've forgotten the name of it. It's one of those what do they call it? Empty or hollow Earth stories. You know, where if you go underneath the layers of the Earth, there's another world.
There's another society.
Underneath like the lost was it lost world? Some sort of lost world thing. So he has one of those stories, which did become quite popular as a science fiction short story, but nowhere near the extent of Sherlock Holmes.
No. It's the market driving him. I think that's what he gets upset about, because Holmes is a moneymaker. and he just felt prostituted, I guess, by it. He had to keep churning them out because that's what people wanted to read, and in a sense he's being told what to write. You can see how he started to bridle against. That's what I think maybe the psychology of it is.
Yeah, there's that lovely story about the publishers coming to him to say, look, we need Sherlock Holmes back, bring him back.
Yes.
And he demanded a ridiculous amount, which he thought they would say no to, because nobody would ever demand such a ridiculous amount. And they said yes, and they went, oh, crap.
Yeah. Now I'm stuffed.
And then he wrote one of the best stories, with the Colonel Moran and the air rifle, made by the blind mechanic von Herder.
I mean, even the names of these stories are fantastic. Like the 5 orange pips.
Yeah,
and, you know.
yeah. That's the one that has the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, the 5 orange pips has the Ku Klux Klan.
It's interesting the way he engages at various points with America and Australia.
Yes, that's right.
Because I
can't remember which one.
The Boscombe Valley mystery.
They've just come back from a
goldfield.
Yes.
Yeah, a rat.
Yes.
Ballarat.
A rat is Ballarat. Yeah.
Cooey is the call that
that's right. That he thinks it's the sun, and
yes, it's quite a dark one, that one, because that's the blackmail one.
Yeah,
the best blackmail one is in The Return, and that's the story of Charles Augustus Milverton, and that I think makes up for a lot of Holmes's misogyny because he lets the woman off. She murders. When they wait, that wonderful scene where they've broken in, they have to get the papers and it all goes wrong, and Milverton comes into the study and he's cracked the safe and the door is a little bit open, and the woman someone in a veil walks in, and she's the one being she has been blackmailed and her life has been ruined, and she shoots him dead. She shoots the blackmailer dead. You've got me, he says.
And he lets her go.
And Holmes lets her go.
There's a story, I can't remember. We were just talking about it.
The Blue Carbuncle.
He lets the thief go.
Yes, he does.
Under the idea that if he gets arrested this time, he will turn to an even bigger thief.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's one of those interesting examples, I think, where Holmes makes a judgment call that's quite questionable.
It's very morally.
It's very morally ambiguous.
Yes.
But in a way, it's one of the things I do actually like about the Holmes story. That he is such a morally ambiguous.
What does he say? That there are certain crimes that the law cannot touch. Therefore, the private citizen has the right to take action. I mean, that's a deeply dodgy view to hold.
It's vigilante.
Yes, it's a vigilante. It's the logic of the vigilante.
But when he exercises that judgment, though, he's usually, not always, but he's usually trying to be compassionate. To that woman, for example. He's not very good at it, but he is like to that woman.
Yes,
he is trying to be compassionate to the circumstances that led to that.
Yes, exactly.
So it's a weird compassion, but it's a compassion.
Yes. But he also, in the more troubling example of the case of identity, he lets the man go who's been impersonating Hosmer Angel, the lover.
And he won't tell the woman.
And apparently I would have thought it was fraud, but apparently no law has been broken. And he lets James Windyback, the impersonator of Hosmer Angel, in order to defraud his stepdaughter of her money, he lets him go.
Yeah, and so she's just got to think that this man's disappeared.
He disappeared and spend her life waiting for him to come back. And that's a very disturbing story.
Yeah, and then he says, something like about women will just think about, they'll be faithful to the memory of their lost love forever.
Oh, he says that she doesn't. They don't want to lose their. And Miss Sutherland, if I tell her, she will not believe me. You may remember the old Persian saying, there is danger for him who taketh the tiger cub, and danger also for whoso snatches a delusion from a woman.
Yeah.
There's as much sense in Hafiz as in Horace, and as much knowledge of the world. Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yes.
That's so much better to think that your fiance's left you for no reason and then just to spend the rest of your life going, hey, is he going to come back today?
It's really nasty. And, of course, it's the vulnerable woman.
Yeah.
The woman who has some money, but who can be tricked out of it.
Yeah. And is valuable because of the kind of... She's got money but no power.
So the implication is that she has to stay mourning this man so that her mother and her new husband can take her money. And that's allowed to stand at the end of that story.
Yeah, it's deeply problematic. I mean, it's... God,
Like,
that's irritating.
It makes me think of a comic strip I saw once on Sherlock Holmes, and it had Holmes sitting in the background and Watson whispering to another woman. He says, but when it comes to human nature, he has no idea. And I think in a way that's
True.
That's quite a true
Yeah.
assessment of Holmes as a
Yes.
character. He's brilliant at
Yes.
looking at the case and solving the case,
Yes.
but when it comes to human nature, absolutely no idea.
Yeah.
Like, not a clue, and he gets it quite wrong
Yeah.
a lot of the time. But and maybe that's part of the dilemma of the detective too. Part of them does get things really right, and part of them are very intelligent.
And that's why you need Watson.
And that's why you need Watson. But the other part, morally, is quite problematic, and also the understanding of human nature and understanding what human nature needs is also a very problematic aspect of Holmes.
He thinks he knows, but he doesn't.
No, he doesn't.
So he reduces everything. I think he calls himself a machine, or does Watson call him a machine? But he reduces. He takes the details away from their human context. It's like extracting them and putting the little pieces on a puzzle board. So I think you're right. He knows nothing about human nature. So he reduces every crime to this series of incidents and objects and clues that have to be put together.
Yeah.
And then we solve it. And then he doesn't give a damn about anything. He doesn't want to know.
Yeah, and then he's done.
Yeah, it's all done. It's a puzzle. The pieces of the puzzle have been fitted together, and then we move
And
on.
the fallout is kind of immaterial.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Watson worries about it, but Holmes never does.
No.
Yeah.
I think we've completely run out of time. So happy 125th anniversary
Yes.
to the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes.
Holmes,
Problematic,
yes.
annoying, but ultimately
But
delightful.
brilliant.
And brilliant.
And brilliant. Always brilliant.
Always brilliant.
Thank you, Lee, for
Thank
bringing
you,
this
Stephanie.
to us.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jimmy, for
Always
sharing
pleasure.
your knowledge of detective fiction.
Yeah.
So we'll see you again in about a week. If you could please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, that would be very, very helpful. Please send any feedback our way. And if you want to tell us about your feelings about Sherlock Holmes and his misogyny, then feel free to drop us a line. All right, thank you.
And if you have a problem.
Yeah, that's right. If you have a crime that needs solving. Thanks. See you guys. Bye.